On a warm May evening in 1996, as the Pacific fog rolled in from the distant coast and settled over the rolling hills of Redwood Falls, California, 19-year-old Elena Marchetti stepped out of her dormitory into what would become the most infamous night in the small university town's history. The campus of Northern California Institute stretched before her like a collection of terracotta-roofed buildings emerging from the mist, their Spanish colonial architecture casting long shadows under the amber streetlights. She had no way of knowing that within hours she would vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions that would haunt the community for decades. The evening air carried the scent of eucalyptus and the distant sound of laughter from the fraternity houses that dotted the hillside. Elena pulled her denim jacket tighter around her shoulders, her long auburn hair catching the light as she walked with purposeful strides toward the off-campus party she'd been invited to attend. Elena Marchetti had arrived at Northern California Institute just 8 months earlier, a bright-eyed freshman from the small farming town of Bakersfield. The daughter of Italian immigrants who ran a successful vineyard, she had grown up surrounded by the rhythms of agricultural life, but her heart had always yearned for something bigger. Architecture fascinated her. The way buildings could tell stories, how spaces could evoke emotions, how structures could stand as monuments to human ambition and creativity. Her parents, Marco and Isabella Marchetti, had initially been hesitant about sending their only daughter so far from home, but Elena's academic prowess and unwavering determination had eventually won them over. She had graduated as valedictorian from Bakersfield High School and earned a partial scholarship to NCI's prestigious architecture program. Her professors already spoke of her as a rising star, someone who possessed both the technical skills and artistic vision necessary to make her mark on the world. But tonight, as Elena walked across the campus that had become her home, none of that future promise seemed to matter. She was troubled by something, a conversation with her roommate earlier that day, perhaps, or the phone call she'd received from home that afternoon. The party was being held at a house on Maple Street, just a few blocks from the main campus. It belonged to Derek Hoffman, a senior in the business program, who was known for throwing elaborate gatherings that attracted students from across the university. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. The end of spring semester was just days away, and summer beckoned with its promise of freedom and possibility. As Elena approached the house, the bass line of music thumped through the walls, and she could see silhouettes moving behind the lit windows. Cars lined both sides of the narrow street, and clusters of students moved between vehicles, red solo cups in hand, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of a stereo playing alternative rock hits that defined the decade. The house itself was a two-story craftsman-style home that had been converted into student housing, its front porch crowded with partygoers who spilled down the steps and onto the small front lawn. Elena hesitated for a moment at the gate, looking up at the scene before her. She didn't know Derek Hoffman personally. The invitation had come through a friend of a friend, the kind of loose social connection that defined college life. But she had decided to come anyway, partly out of curiosity and partly out of a desire to break free from the routine of studying and dormitory life that had consumed most of her freshman year. Inside, the party was in full swing. The living room had been cleared of most furniture to create a makeshift dance floor, where couples swayed to the music while others stood in small groups, shouting conversations over the noise. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of beer, and Elena found herself immediately overwhelmed by the chaos and energy of it all. She made her way to the kitchen, where a keg had been set up on the back porch, and students were helping themselves to drinks. Elena accepted a beer from someone she didn't recognize and tried to blend into the crowd, but her height and striking appearance made her stand out even in the dim lighting. Several people approached her throughout the evening, but she seemed distant, distracted, as if her mind were elsewhere. Among those who noticed Elena was Marcus Rivera, a junior studying criminal justice, who lived in the on-campus housing complex where Elena had her dormitory room. Marcus had seen her around campus and had always been struck by her beauty and intelligence. but he had never worked up the courage to introduce himself. Tonight, fortified by several beers and the festive atmosphere, he decided to approach her. "You're Elena, right?" he said, appearing beside her as she stood near the back door, looking out at the small backyard where a few people were gathered around a portable stereo. "I've seen you around campus. I'm Marcus." Elena turned to look at him, and for a moment her face brightened with the first genuine smile he had seen from her all evening. Marcus was handsome in an understated way, with dark hair and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. There was something about his demeanor that put her at ease, a quality that would later prove significant in the investigation that followed. "Nice to meet you, Marcus," she replied, her voice carrying just a hint of the accent she had inherited from her parents. "I don't think I've seen you around before." "I live in Sequoia Hall," he said, referring to one of the dormitory buildings that sat adjacent to Elena's own residence hall. "I've been meaning to introduce myself for months, but you always seem to be rushing off to class or the library." They talked for nearly an hour, standing on the back porch and then moving to a quieter corner of the living room. Elena seemed to relax in Marcus's company, and he was struck by her intelligence and passion for her studies. But as the night wore on and the party grew more raucous, Elena began to seem uncomfortable again. The crowd had thickened, and several people had clearly had too much to drink. A group of fraternity members had taken over the stereo and were playing increasingly loud music, and the atmosphere had shifted from festive to chaotic. Also watching Elena from across the room was Vincent Torres, a sophomore who lived in the same dormitory complex as Marcus. Vincent had a reputation on campus as something of a troublemaker, not dangerous exactly, but unpredictable. He had been involved in several incidents over the course of the academic year, including a fight at a bar downtown that had resulted in his arrest, though charges had ultimately been dropped. Vincent was tall and athletic, with the kind of rugged good looks that attracted attention, but there was something unsettling about his presence. His eyes had a way of lingering on people, particularly women, in a manner that made them uncomfortable. Several female students had complained to resident advisors about his behavior, describing unwanted attention and a tendency to appear wherever they happened to be. Tonight Vincent had been drinking heavily, and his usual carefully controlled demeanor had given way to something more aggressive. He had been watching Elena for most of the evening, noting how she interacted with Marcus and the way other men at the party seemed drawn to her. There was something possessive in his gaze, as if he had already decided that she should be his. As the evening progressed toward midnight, Elena began to show signs that she had consumed more alcohol than she was used to. Marcus noticed that her speech had become slightly slurred and that she seemed unsteady on her feet. He suggested that perhaps she should head back to her dormitory, but Elena waved off his concern, insisting that she was fine. It was around this time that Vincent approached their conversation. He inserted himself into their discussion with the kind of aggressive friendliness that masked darker intentions, immediately positioning himself between Elena and Marcus in a way that seemed both protective and possessive. "Elena, right?" Vincent said, his voice carrying just a hint of slur from his own alcohol consumption. "I've been wanting to meet you all semester. You're even more beautiful up close." Elena stepped back slightly, clearly uncomfortable with his proximity and the intensity of his attention. Marcus noticed her discomfort and moved closer, but Vincent seemed oblivious to the social cues that suggested his advances were unwelcome. "I think Elena was just saying she wanted to head back to the dorm," Marcus interjected, trying to defuse the situation while giving Elena an opportunity to extract herself from the conversation. "The night's still young," Vincent replied, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "Come on, let's get some fresh air. I know a great spot where we can see the whole campus. Actually, I really should get going," Elena said, her voice carrying a note of firmness that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. "I have an early class tomorrow." But as she turned to leave, Elena suddenly stumbled, her coordination clearly affected by the alcohol she had consumed throughout the night. Vincent immediately reached out to steady her, his hands lingering on her arms in a way that made Marcus uneasy. "See? You definitely shouldn't be walking home alone in this condition," Vincent said, his tone taking on a protective quality that didn't match the predatory look in his eyes. "I'll walk you back. My dorm is right next to yours anyway." Marcus started to object, but Elena seemed too disoriented to fully process what was happening. The combination of alcohol, the loud music, and the crowded, chaotic environment had clearly overwhelmed her, and she appeared to be on the verge of being sick. "No need for that," he said. "I've got this handled. Come on, Elena. Let's get you home safely." As they prepared to leave the party, another student joined their group. Rebecca Patterson was a junior who lived in Elena's dormitory and had noticed the situation developing from across the room. Rebecca had her own history with Vincent. He had pursued her earlier in the semester with the same aggressive intensity he was now showing toward Elena, and she had found his attention deeply unsettling. "I'll walk back with you guys," Rebecca announced, inserting herself into the group in a way that was clearly intended to provide Elena with additional support and protection. "I need to get back anyway." Vincent's jaw tightened at Rebecca's intrusion, but he couldn't object without appearing suspicious or controlling. The four of them, Elena, Vincent, Marcus, and Rebecca, began the journey back toward the dormitory complex, walking through the quiet residential streets that surrounded the campus. The night air was cool and damp, and the fog had thickened considerably since Elena had left her room earlier that evening. Streetlights created pools of amber illumination every 50 yards or so, but between them, the darkness was nearly complete. The group walked slowly, with Elena leaning heavily on Rebecca for support and occasionally stopping to steady herself. As they reached the edge of campus, Marcus realized he needed to head in a different direction to reach his own dormitory. He hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Elena in Vincent's company, but Rebecca seemed to understand his concern and nodded reassuringly. "We'll be fine from here," she said. "It's just a few more blocks." With Marcus gone, the group had been reduced to 3. Elena, who was now struggling to maintain her balance, Rebecca, who was trying to support her while keeping a watchful eye on Vincent, and Vincent himself, who had grown increasingly quiet and intense as they approached the dormitory complex. The buildings that housed NCI's residential students were arranged in a rough rectangle around a central courtyard, with Elena's building, Redwood Hall, located at the far end of the complex. Vincent's dormitory, Pine Hall, was adjacent to Elena's, separated by a narrow walkway that was poorly lit and bordered by dense landscaping. As they reached the courtyard, Rebecca announced that she needed to stop at the mailboxes before going up to her room. Elena mumbled something about being fine to walk the rest of the way on her own, but Vincent immediately stepped forward. "I'll make sure she gets to her room safely," he said, his tone suggesting that this was not really a request. "My building is right there anyway." Rebecca hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of leaving Elena alone with Vincent, but Elena herself seemed barely conscious at this point, and was swaying on her feet. The situation had reached a critical juncture, and the decision made in the next few moments would determine everything that followed. "Actually, I think I should," Rebecca began, but Elena cut her off. "I'm fine," Elena slurred, her words barely comprehensible. "Just need to get to my room." She took a few unsteady steps toward her dormitory, and Vincent immediately moved to support her, wrapping his arm around her waist in a gesture that appeared helpful but felt predatory to anyone watching closely. Rebecca stood frozen for a moment, torn between her own needs and her growing concern for Elena's safety. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" Rebecca called after them, as Elena and Vincent began walking toward the narrow path that led between the 2 dormitory buildings. Elena waved weakly without turning around, and Vincent called back over his shoulder, "Don't worry, I've got her." And with that, Rebecca made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She turned toward the mailboxes, telling herself that Vincent lived just next door, and that Elena would be safe for the few minutes it would take to cover the remaining distance to her room. As Elena and Vincent disappeared into the shadows between the buildings, the fog seemed to swallow them whole. The last anyone would see of Elena Marchetti was her silhouette disappearing into that narrow, poorly lit walkway, supported by a man whose intentions were anything but noble. What happened in those final moments would become the subject of intense speculation and investigation. Vincent would later claim that he had walked Elena as far as his own dormitory entrance, and then watched as she continued on to her building alone. But there were no witnesses to corroborate his story, and Elena never made it to her room. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning, when Elena's roommate, Amy Richardson, woke to find Elena's bed unslept in. Amy had returned early from the party and assumed Elena was staying out later than usual, but as the hours passed and Elena failed to appear, concern began to build. By Sunday afternoon, when Elena had missed 2 scheduled study sessions and failed to answer her phone repeatedly, Amy contacted the resident advisor. The RA, a senior named Michael Brooks, initially downplayed the concern, suggesting that Elena had probably spent the night at a friend's place and would turn up soon. But as Sunday evening turned into Monday morning and Elena missed her first class, something she had never done in her entire freshman year, it became clear that this was not a simple case of a college student losing track of time. Elena Marchetti had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the clothes in her closet, the books on her desk, and a growing sense of dread that something terrible had happened in the fog-shrouded darkness of that May night. The investigation that would follow would uncover a web of secrets, lies, and disturbing behavior that few on the picturesque NCI campus could have imagined. But as the fog lifted on that first morning after Elena's disappearance, revealing the sun-drenched hills and Spanish colonial architecture that made Redwood Falls such an idyllic setting for higher education, no one yet understood that they were looking at the scene of what would become one of California's most notorious unsolved mysteries. In her dormitory room, Elena's architecture textbooks lay open to a chapter about sustainable design, her neat handwriting filling the margins with observations about how buildings could be designed to exist in harmony with their natural environment. On her desk, a half-finished letter to her parents spoke of her excitement about upcoming finals and her plans to return home to Bakersfield for the summer. Everything suggested a young woman with a bright future ahead of her, someone who had simply stepped out for an evening and planned to return. But Elena Marchetti would never return, and as the investigation began in earnest, it would become clear that the fog that had rolled in from the Pacific that night had concealed far more than just the physical landscape of Redwood Falls. It had hidden secrets that would take decades to uncover, lies that would destroy lives, and a truth so disturbing that some would argue it should have remained buried forever. The last person to see Elena alive, or so he claimed, was Vincent Torres, whose story about walking her partway home and then leaving her to continue alone would become the focal point of an investigation that would consume the resources of multiple law enforcement agencies and capture the attention of the national media. But as the first detectives arrived on campus to begin their inquiry, they had no way of knowing that Vincent Torres was far more dangerous than he appeared, or that Elena's disappearance was not the random act of violence it seemed to be, but rather the culmination of a pattern of predatory behavior that had been escalating for months. The fog had lifted, but the mystery was just beginning. Detective Catherine Reyes had seen enough missing persons cases in her 15 years with the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Department to know that the first 48 hours were critical. When the call came in on Monday morning, May 27th, about a missing student at Northern California Institute, her first instinct was skepticism. College kids disappeared all the time, usually turning up hungover at a friend's place or sleeping off a weekend bender in some unexpected location. But something about this case felt different from the moment she stepped onto the NCI campus and saw the genuine fear in Amy Richardson's eyes. Amy had spent a sleepless night pacing their shared dormitory room, Elena's untouched bed serving as a constant reminder that something was terribly wrong. She had called Elena's parents in Bakersfield at dawn, hoping against hope that her roommate had somehow made it home during the night. The conversation with Marco and Isabella Marchetti had been brief and devastating. Elena had not contacted them, and they were already making arrangements to drive north. "She's never done anything like this before," Amy told Detective Reyes, her voice breaking, as they stood in the cramped dorm room that still held the lingering scent of Elena's favorite perfume. "Elena is the most responsible person I know. She calls her parents twice a week, never misses class, always tells me where she's going. This isn't like her." Detective Reyes, a woman in her early 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, examined the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed hundreds of crime scenes. Elena's side of the room was meticulously organized. Textbooks arranged by subject, clothes hung neatly in the closet, a small collection of family photos arranged on her desk. Everything spoke of a young woman who lived her life with purpose and intention. "Tell me about Saturday night," Detective Reyes said, settling into Elena's desk chair and pulling out a worn notebook. "Walk me through everything you remember." Amy recounted the evening's events, describing how she had left the party early while Elena stayed behind. She mentioned Marcus Rivera and Rebecca Patterson, and how she had last seen Elena being helped home by Vincent Torres. As Amy spoke, Detective Reyes noticed how the young woman's voice grew more uncertain when she mentioned Vincent's name. "What can you tell me about this Vincent Torres?" the detective asked. Amy hesitated, clearly wrestling with whether to voice her concerns. "He's intense," she finally said. "Elena mentioned him a few times over the past month. He started showing up places where she would be, the library, the dining hall, even walking past our building at odd hours. She thought it was coincidental at first, but then it started to feel deliberate." This was the first piece of information that made Detective Reyes's instincts sharpen with interest. In her experience, missing persons cases involving young women often began with a pattern of unwanted attention that escalated into something more dangerous. Within an hour of finishing her interview with Amy, Detective Reyes had established a command center in the campus security office and begun the process of tracking down everyone who had seen Elena on Saturday night. The university's police department, led by Chief Harold Brennan, had initially been reluctant to treat the case as a serious investigation, preferring to believe that Elena would turn up on her own. But Detective Reyes's reputation for thoroughness and her insistence that time was of the essence had convinced them to provide full cooperation. The first person she interviewed was Marcus Rivera, who had been easy to locate through the campus directory. Marcus appeared genuinely distraught about Elena's disappearance and provided a detailed account of his conversation with her at the party. He described her as seeming troubled about something, though she hadn't specified what was bothering her. She kept looking around the room like she was searching for someone, or trying to avoid someone, Marcus told the detective. "At first I thought she was just overwhelmed by the crowd, but now I wonder if she was uncomfortable because of Vincent." Marcus went on to describe the walk back toward the dormitories and his reluctance to leave Elena alone with Vincent. "There was something about the way he looked at her," he said, "like he was claiming her somehow. It made my skin crawl." "He doesn't understand the word no," Rebecca said, her voice tight with anger and fear. "I tried to warn Elena about him, but she said he seemed harmless enough. I should have insisted on walking her all the way to her room that night. I keep thinking that if I had just..." She broke off, unable to finish the sentence. This development transformed the investigation from a missing persons case into something far more serious. Detective Reyes immediately issued a BOLO, be on the lookout alert for Vincent and his vehicle, a dark blue 1992 Honda Civic with distinctive aftermarcations that made it easily recognizable. Elena's parents arrived Tuesday evening, their faces etched with the kind of desperate hope that Detective Reyes had seen too many times before. Marco Marchetti was a tall, dignified man whose hands showed the calluses of someone who worked the land, while Isabella was a petite woman whose dark eyes held a fierce intelligence. They had driven straight through from Bakersfield, stopping only for gas and coffee, sustained by the belief that they could somehow will their daughter back into existence through the sheer force of their love. "Our Elena is a fighter," Isabella told Detective Reyes during their first meeting. "Whatever has happened to her, she will not give up. We must not give up either." The first major break in the case came on Wednesday morning, when Vincent Torres's Honda Civic was found abandoned in a parking lot at Pismo Beach, roughly 30 miles south of Redwood Falls. The vehicle had been there for at least 2 days, according to witnesses, and showed no obvious signs of violence or struggle. But the discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why had Vincent driven to the coast, and where had he gone from there? A forensics team processed the car thoroughly, finding Vincent's fingerprints throughout the interior, but no trace of Elena's presence. However, they did discover something that made Detective Reyes's blood run cold. A collection of photographs hidden in the glove compartment, showing various female students on the NCI campus, apparently taken without their knowledge from a distance. Several of the images showed Elena going about her daily routine, walking to class, studying in the library, sitting alone in the dining hall. Armed with this evidence, Detective Reyes obtained search warrants for Vincent's dormitory room and his family home in nearby Santa Barbara. The search of his dorm room revealed even more disturbing material: a detailed journal documenting his thoughts about Elena and other female students, filled with increasingly violent fantasies and detailed plans for approaching them. One entry, dated just 3 days before Elena's disappearance, read, "She thinks she can ignore me, but she's wrong. I see how she looks at other guys, how she smiles at them when she won't even acknowledge me. She needs to learn that I'm the one who really cares about her. I'm the one who's been watching out for her. Soon she'll understand." The journal also contained what appeared to be a crude map of the campus, with Elena's daily routes marked in red ink and her class schedule written out in Vincent's distinctive handwriting. Most chilling of all were the detailed observations about her habits: what time she typically returned to her dorm, which routes she preferred to take, even which bathroom stalls she used in the library. As the evidence mounted, Detective Reyes felt the familiar weight of a case that was becoming increasingly complex. Vincent Torres was clearly disturbed and had been stalking Elena, but his disappearance complicated everything. Was he a perpetrator who had fled after committing a crime, or was he another victim of whatever had happened that night? The answer came on Thursday afternoon, when a hiker discovered Vincent's body at the bottom of a cliff along the rugged coastline south of Pismo Beach. He had been there for several days, and while the initial examination suggested he had fallen, the circumstances were suspicious enough to warrant a full investigation. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the county medical examiner, conducted the autopsy with the thorough precision that had made her one of the most respected forensic pathologists in California. Her preliminary findings raised more questions than they answered. "The injuries are consistent with a fall from a significant height," she told Detective Reyes as they stood in the sterile examination room, where Vincent's body lay on the table. "But there are some unusual aspects that concern me." She pointed to several bruises on Vincent's arms and torso that appeared to be defensive wounds, suggesting he had been in some kind of struggle before his death. More puzzling still were trace amounts of a sedative found in his bloodstream. Not enough to kill him, but sufficient to impair his judgment and coordination. "Someone drugged him?" Detective Reyes asked. "It's possible," Dr. Hartwell replied carefully. "The levels are low enough that they could be from voluntary consumption, perhaps mixed with alcohol. But given the timing and circumstances, we can't rule out foul play." The discovery of Vincent's body forced Detective Reyes to completely reassess her theory of the case. If Vincent had been murdered, then who was responsible for Elena's disappearance? And why would someone want both of them dead? The investigation took another unexpected turn when Detective Reyes received a phone call from Detective James Morrison of the Santa Barbara Police Department. Morrison had been investigating a series of sexual assaults near the University of California Santa Barbara campus, and Vincent Torres had been a person of interest in those cases. "We've been tracking him for months," Morrison explained during their phone conversation. 3 separate incidents involving female students who were approached by a man matching his description. In each case, the victims reported that the suspect seemed to know details about their personal lives and schedules that suggested he had been watching them for some time. This information painted Vincent in an even more sinister light, but it also opened up new possibilities. Had one of his previous victims or their families decided to take matters into their own hands, or was there someone else entirely who had been watching Vincent just as he had been watching Elena? The breakthrough Detective Reyes had been hoping for came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the evidence collected from Vincent's car, a forensics technician noticed something that had been initially overlooked: a small piece of paper wedged under the passenger seat that contained a phone number written in unfamiliar handwriting. The number belonged to a cell phone registered to a man named David Kellerman, who worked as a maintenance supervisor at Northern California Institute. When Detective Reyes ran a background check on Kellerman, she discovered a criminal history that included a conviction for assault and battery, as well as several arrests for trespassing and harassment that had been dismissed on technicalities. Kellerman's position at the university gave him access to every building on campus, including the dormitories where students lived. More importantly, his work schedule meant that he was often on campus during evening and night hours when most other staff members had gone home. When Detective Reyes and her partner, Detective Frank Rodriguez, arrived at Kellerman's off-campus apartment for questioning, they found a man in his late 30s, whose nervous demeanor immediately raised red flags. Kellerman was thin and wiry, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to constantly dart around the room as if looking for escape routes. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kellerman insisted when shown the phone number found in Vincent's car. "I never gave anyone my number," but his body language told a different story. Detective Reyes noticed how his hands shook as he lit a cigarette, and how his voice cracked when he spoke. Years of experience had taught her to recognize the signs of someone who was hiding something significant. "David," she said, using his first name to establish a more personal connection. "We know that Vincent Torres had your phone number. We also know that you work night shifts on campus and would have access to the dormitory buildings. What we don't know is why a maintenance worker would be in contact with a student who was stalking female residents." "Vincent came to me about a month ago," he said quietly. "He said he was worried about one of the female students, that she was being harassed by someone, and he wanted to help protect her. He asked if I could let him into her building after hours, so he could check on her." The confession sent a chill down Detective Reyes's spine. "And you agreed to this?" "He seemed genuinely concerned," Kellerman said defensively, "and he offered to pay me. Times have been tough since my divorce, and the money helped with child support payments." "How many times did you let him into the dormitory buildings?" Kellerman's silence stretched for several long moments before he finally answered, "Maybe 6 or 7 times over the past month. Always late at night, after the residents were supposed to be asleep. He said he just wanted to make sure everything was secure." Detective Reyes felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed was even more disturbing than she had imagined. Vincent Torres had not only been stalking Elena and other female students, he had been paying a university employee to give him access to their most private and secure spaces. "David, I need you to think very carefully about your answer to this next question," Detective Reyes said, leaning forward in her chair. "Did you let Vincent into the dormitories on the night of Saturday, May?" Kellerman's face went pale, and his hands began to shake more violently. Yes. He called me around 2:30 in the morning. Said it was an emergency, that he needed to check on the girl he'd been worried about. I met him at the service entrance to Redwood Hall and let him in." "And what time did he leave?" "I don't know. I went home after letting him in. He said he'd make sure the door locked behind him when he left." The implications of this revelation were staggering. Vincent Torres had been inside Elena's dormitory building during the critical hours when she had disappeared. But if he had been the one responsible for her disappearance, who had killed him? And more importantly, Where was Elena? Detective Reyes immediately obtained another search warrant, this time for David Kellerman's apartment and vehicle. The search revealed additional evidence of his complicity in Vincent's activities, including cash payments that corresponded to the dates when Vincent had been given access to the dormitory buildings. But it also revealed something else that changed the entire trajectory of the investigation. A composition notebook hidden in Kellerman's bedroom closet, filled with detailed observations about the female students who lived in the dormitories he had access to. The notebook contained information that could only have been obtained through systematic spying. Details about their personal habits, their schedules, even intimate details about their private lives. Elena's name appeared throughout the notebook, along with those of at least a dozen other students. Vincent wasn't working alone. Detective Reyes told her partner as they stood in Kellerman's living room, surrounded by evidence bags and feeling the weight of a case that was becoming more complex by the hour. And I don't think Kellerman was just providing access to the buildings. I think he was gathering intelligence on these girls and sharing it with Vincent. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear, but crucial questions remained unanswered. If Vincent and Kellerman had been working together to stalk and potentially assault female students, what had gone wrong on the night Elena disappeared? Had there been a falling out between the two men? Had Kellerman killed Vincent to cover up their activities? And most critically, if Elena had been taken from her dormitory building that night, where was she now? The answer would come from the most unexpected source of all, and when it did, it would reveal that everything Detective Reyes thought she knew about the case had been built on a foundation of lies and misdirection that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The break in the case came at 3:47 a.m. on a fog-shrouded Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Elena Marchetti had vanished into the misty darkness between the dormitory buildings. Detective Catherine Reyes was jolted awake by the shrill ring of her bedside phone, her years of experience allowing her to transition instantly from sleep to full alertness. Detective Reyes was in her car within minutes, her mind racing as she navigated the empty streets toward the university campus. Could it really be Elena, alive after a week of intensive searching, or was this some kind of cruel hoax perpetrated by someone seeking attention or attempting to derail the investigation? It was indeed Elena Marchetti, but she was almost unrecognizable from the vibrant, confident student whose photographs had been plastered across missing person flyers throughout California. Her auburn hair was dirty and tangled, her face gaunt and pale, and her green eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of experiences no one should ever have to endure. Worst of all were the bruises that covered her arms and the rope burns around her wrists, evidence of the ordeal she had somehow survived. "Elena," Detective Reyes said softly, settling into a chair across from the young woman. "My name is Catherine. I've been looking for you. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" "I escaped," she said simply. "I've been running all night. I didn't know where else to go." What Elena told Detective Reyes over the next several hours would not only solve the mystery of her disappearance, but would expose a conspiracy so shocking and far-reaching that it would ultimately result in the arrest of 7 individuals and force a complete overhaul of campus security policies nationwide. The truth, as Elena revealed it, began not on the night of the party, but months earlier, when she had first noticed someone following her around campus. Initially, she had dismissed it as coincidence, the same face appearing in the library, the dining hall, or walking behind her between classes. But as the encounters became more frequent and deliberate, she had begun to feel genuinely frightened. The he she was referring to was not Vincent Torres, as the investigation had assumed, but David Kellerman, the maintenance supervisor who had access to every building on campus, and who had been using that access to establish an elaborate surveillance network targeting female students. Vincent Torres was never the mastermind, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger as she recounted her ordeal. He was just another victim. Kellerman had been manipulating him for months, feeding him information about my schedule and encouraging his obsession. Kellerman knew that if anything happened to me, Vincent would be the obvious suspect. The scope of Kellerman's operation was breathtaking in its complexity and chilling in its implications. Using his position as a maintenance supervisor, he had installed hidden cameras in dormitory common areas, study rooms, and even some private bathrooms. He had recruited a network of student employees who worked in various campus offices, paying them to provide information about female students' academic schedules, housing assignments, and personal details from their files. Most disturbing of all, Kellerman had been selling this information to a network of individuals both on and off campus who shared his predatory interests. Vincent Torres had been one of his customers, paying hundreds of dollars for detailed intelligence about Elena's daily routine and personal habits. On the night of the party, Vincent contacted Kellerman after we left. Elena explained, but not because he was planning to hurt me. He was genuinely trying to help me get back to my room safely. When we reached the walkway between the buildings, someone was waiting for us. That someone had been Kellerman himself, along with two accomplices whose identities Elena was still too traumatized to fully reveal. They had been expecting Vincent's call and had used it as an opportunity to eliminate both Vincent, who had become a liability to their operation, and Elena, who had begun asking too many questions about the surveillance she had noticed. They drugged Vincent first, Elena said, her hands shaking as she recalled the memory. He collapsed right there in the walkway. I tried to run, but they caught me before I could reach my dormitory. They dragged us both to a van that was parked in the service area behind the buildings. But the plan had gone wrong when Vincent had regained consciousness sooner than expected and had attempted to fight back. In the struggle that followed, one of Kellerman's accomplices had struck Vincent too hard, killing him instantly rather than allowing for the elaborate staging they had planned. They panicked, Elena said. They couldn't make it look like murder-suicide anymore, because Vincent was obviously beaten to death. So they decided to dump his body at the coast and make it look like he had killed me and then committed suicide by jumping off the cliff. Left alone with Elena, Kellerman and his remaining accomplice had been forced to revise their plan. They had kept her alive, hoping to eventually stage her death in a way that would close the case without implicating them. But Elena had proven to be far more resourceful than they had anticipated. I pretended to be more traumatized than I was, she explained. I acted catatonic, like I was in shock. They thought I was no longer a threat, so they became careless about restraining me properly. Elena's escape had come on Wednesday night, when her captors had left her alone in the cabin while they went to dispose of evidence. Using a broken piece of ceramic from a shattered coffee mug, she had managed to cut through the ropes binding her wrists and had fled into the forest. She had walked and run for nearly 12 hours, following creek beds and deer trails until she had finally reached a road that led back toward Redwood Falls. As Elena's story unfolded, Detective Reyes felt a mixture of admiration for the young woman's courage and horror at the scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered. This was not simply a case of one disturbed individual stalking female students. It was a systematic operation that had been exploiting and endangering dozens of young women for months, if not years. Elena, I need you to tell me everything you can remember about the location where you were held, Detective Reyes said. Can you describe the cabin, the route they took to get there? Anything that might help us find these men before they hurt someone else. Elena's description of the cabin was detailed enough to allow investigators to narrow down the search area significantly. She remembered specific landmarks from the journey: a distinctive red barn, a bridge over a creek, a billboard advertising a local restaurant. Most importantly, she had managed to overhear conversations between her captors that revealed the names of other members of their network. Within hours of Elena's return, Detective Reyes had coordinated with multiple law enforcement agencies to launch simultaneous raids on locations throughout Central California. The operation, which would later be dubbed Operation Sanctuary by the media, resulted in the arrest of 7 individuals and the recovery of evidence that would ultimately lead to the prosecution of more than 20 people. David Kellerman was arrested at his apartment, where investigators found a sophisticated computer setup containing thousands of hours of surveillance footage and detailed files on more than 50 female students. His accomplice in Elena's kidnapping, a drifter named Carl Brennan, who had no connection to the university but shared Kellerman's predatory interests, was captured at a truck stop near Bakersfield, apparently fleeing toward Mexico. But perhaps the most shocking arrest was that of Dr. Robert Hensley, a respected psychology professor at Northern California Institute, who had been using his position to identify vulnerable students and providing their personal information to Kellerman's network. Hensley's academic reputation and access to student counseling records had made him an invaluable asset to the conspiracy, and his betrayal of the trust placed in him by his students represented perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire operation. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of what prosecutors would later call the most extensive campus predator network in American history. The conspiracy had tentacles reaching into multiple universities across California, with similar operations being conducted at UC Santa Barbara, UC San Luis Obispo, and several community colleges. The network had been operating with near impunity for over 3 years, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue through the sale of surveillance footage, personal information, and even more disturbing services that prosecutors declined to detail publicly. The sophistication of their operation and the number of victims involved made it clear that this was not the work of a few isolated individuals, but rather a carefully organized criminal enterprise. Elena's testimony would prove crucial in securing convictions against all 7 primary defendants. Her courage in surviving her ordeal and her willingness to relive her trauma in open court would help ensure that justice was served not only for her, but for the dozens of other victims whose suffering had gone undetected for years. David Kellerman was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, convicted on charges including kidnapping, conspiracy, voyeurism, and accessory to murder in Vincent Torres's death. Hensley received a sentence of 25 years to life, while the other conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. But for all the successful prosecutions and policy changes that resulted from the case, Elena Marchetti's ordeal was far from over when the courtroom doors closed for the final time. The trauma of her kidnapping and the weeks of testimony required to secure convictions had taken a tremendous toll on her mental and physical health. She withdrew from Northern California Institute at the end of her freshman year, unable to bear the constant reminders of what had happened to her on the campus where she had once felt safe. Her dreams of becoming an architect seemed like relics from a different lifetime, casualties of the violence that had shattered her sense of security and trust in the world around her. Elena's parents, Marco and Isabella, made the difficult decision to leave their vineyard in Bakersfield and relocate to Oregon, where Elena could begin the long process of healing away from the media attention and painful memories that surrounded her in California. The family that had once been defined by their optimism and faith in the future now struggled to rebuild their lives in the shadow of trauma that would never fully fade. Detective Catherine Reyes, whose dogged investigation had been instrumental in exposing the conspiracy and bringing the perpetrators to justice, found that the case had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. The depth of the evil she had uncovered and the systematic nature of the abuse that had been inflicted on so many young women left her questioning her faith in humanity and struggling with nightmares that persisted long after the case was closed. The Northern California Institute campus itself underwent massive changes in the wake of the scandal. Entire administrative staff were replaced, security systems were completely overhauled, and new policies were implemented to protect student privacy and safety. The dormitory buildings where Elena had lived were eventually demolished and replaced with new facilities designed with security as the primary consideration. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Elena's ordeal was the federal legislation that bore her name, the Elena Marchetti Campus Safety Act, which required all institutions of higher education receiving federal funding to implement comprehensive background checks for all employees with access to student housing facilities and to establish strict protocols for the handling of student personal information. 5 years after her disappearance, Elena Marchetti agreed to give her first and only public interview about her ordeal. Speaking to a reporter from the Los Angeles Times, she had regained much of her strength and composure, though the haunted quality in her eyes remained as a permanent reminder of what she had endured. "People ask me if I'm angry about what happened," she said during the interview, which took place in the garden of the small Oregon home where she lived with her parents. "And the truth is, I am angry. I'm angry that Vincent Torres died because he tried to help me. I'm angry that so many other women were victimized while this network operated with impunity. I'm angry that people in positions of trust betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible." She paused, looking out at the mountains that rose in the distance, a landscape far different from the rolling hills and Spanish colonial architecture of Northern California Institute, where her ordeal had begun. "But I'm also grateful," she continued. "Grateful to be alive, grateful for the people who never stopped looking for me, and grateful for the opportunity to ensure that what happened to me and to so many others will be much harder for anyone to do again." Elena had never returned to architecture school, but she had found a different calling in victim advocacy work. She had earned a degree in social work from Portland State University and had established a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of campus sexual assault and stalking. Her work had helped hundreds of young women find the strength to report crimes, seek counseling, and rebuild their lives. The case of Elena Marchetti's disappearance and rescue had become a watershed moment in the national conversation about campus safety and the vulnerability of college students to predatory behavior. It had exposed the ways in which institutional failures and individual corruption could combine to create environments where the most vulnerable members of the community were systematically exploited and abused. But beyond its impact on policy and public awareness, Elena's story remained, at its core, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of courage in the face of unimaginable adversity. A 19-year-old girl who had set out for a party on a foggy May evening and walked into a nightmare had not only survived her ordeal, but had transformed it into a force for positive change that would protect countless others. As Detective Reyes had learned during her years of investigating the worst that humanity had to offer, evil was real and pervasive, capable of disguising itself behind facades of respectability and authority. But she had also learned that goodness was equally real, equally pervasive, and ultimately more powerful than the darkness it fought against. The fog that had rolled in from the Pacific on that May night in 1996 had concealed terrible secrets and enabled unconscionable crimes. But when it finally lifted, it revealed not only the truth about what had happened to Elena Marchetti, but also the truth about the strength and determination that lived within her and within all those who refused to accept that evil should go unpunished or that victims should be forgotten. Elena Marchetti had vanished into the fog as a frightened college freshman with dreams of designing beautiful buildings. She had emerged from her ordeal as something far more important, a survivor whose courage and refusal to be silenced had helped to build something more valuable than any structure of steel and stone. A safer world for the young women who would follow in her footsteps, walking across college campuses on foggy nights, trusting that someone would always be watching out for them, ready to fight for them if the darkness tried to claim them. The case was closed, but its legacy would endure forever, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, hope could survive, truth could prevail, and justice, though sometimes delayed, could still be served.